In 1970, engineers tried to move a modern obelisk replica using only ancient tools, to prove it was impossible without advanced technology. It worked. On the first real attempt, using nothing but rope, wood, water, and about 100 people. That single experiment quietly ended one of the internet's favorite conspiracy theories, but almost nobody heard about it, because ancient aliens moved giant rocks with anti-gravity beams is a much better headline than ancient Egyptians were really, really good at physics. So today, we're doing the boring version. The true version. And I promise it's actually more impressive. The unfinished obelisk still sitting in the quarry at Aswan weighs an estimated 1,090 tons. That's heavier than a Boeing 747. And it was carved almost entirely out of solid granite, one of the hardest stones on Earth, using tools that were mostly made of an even softer stone called dolerite. Here's the number that trips people up: some finished obelisks, fully carved and polished, were transported hundreds of miles down the Nile and then stood upright in city centers, without a single crane, pulley system with mechanical advantage, or engine of any kind. For decades, that gap between "we understand physics" and "we can't explain how they moved that rock" got filled with the same lazy answer as the pyramids: aliens, lost civilizations, forgotten anti-gravity technology. It's a good story. It's also completely unnecessary, because the Egyptians left the instructions in plain sight, carved into their own tomb walls, and we mostly just ignored them. Step 1: Pounding stone. Egyptians didn't chisel granite the way you'd carve wood. Granite is too hard for that. Instead, workers used dolerite pounders, hand-sized balls of an even harder stone, and simply hammered the granite surface over and over, grinding it down millimeter by millimeter through repeated percussion. It's slow. It's brutal on the hands. And it's completely explainable. Archaeologists have found thousands of these pounding balls scattered around the Aswan quarry, along with unfinished cut marks that show exactly this technique in progress. Step 2: Water did the heavy lifting. This is the part most people miss entirely. Sand, when dry, creates enormous friction under a heavy sledge. But wet sand behaves differently. It becomes firmer and less prone to bunching up in front of the sledge's runners. A team from the University of Amsterdam actually tested this in a lab in 2014, dragging a scaled-down sledge across sand, and found that wetting the sand in front of it reduced the friction dramatically, by roughly half. And there's a wall painting from the tomb of Jehudi-Hotep, dated to around 1900 BC, showing exactly this: a man pouring water in front of a sledge as it hauls a massive statue. The Egyptians didn't just know this trick. They documented it, in art, 4,000 years ago. Step 3: The river was the real machine. Moving a 1,000-ton block over land is hard even with wet sand and rope. So mostly, the Egyptians didn't. They used the Nile. Obelisks were transported by barge, using massive wooden boats built specifically for the job, sometimes over 200 feet long. During the Nile's annual flood season, water levels rose high enough to float these barges close to the quarry and close to the temple site, cutting the overland hauling distance down to almost nothing. The flood wasn't an obstacle the Egyptians worked around, it was their transportation infrastructure. They timed entire construction projects around it. Step 4: Standing it upright with nothing but sand and rope. The final trick is the cleverest. To raise an obelisk vertically, engineers believe workers built a ramp and dug a deep pit filled with sand at its base, positioned exactly where the obelisk's foot needed to land. The obelisk was dragged up the ramp until its base tipped into the sand pit. Then, workers slowly removed the sand from the pit through a hole at the bottom, letting the obelisk's weight gradually lower it into a near-vertical position as the sand drained out, using gravity and granular flow instead of brute lifting force. Ropes and teams of men did the final fine adjustment to bring it perfectly upright. This is exactly the method that engineer Mark Lehner and a team successfully tested in the 1990s, moving and partially raising a smaller obelisk replica using only tools and materials available in ancient Egypt. The real secret: scale, not magic. None of these techniques were secret or lost. What made it possible was organization at a scale that's honestly hard to imagine today: tens of thousands of workers, fed and housed by the state, coordinated across projects that took years, sometimes generations. The magic was logistics and manpower, not physics-defying technology. So no, the Egyptians didn't need aliens. They needed dolerite pounders, wet sand, a flooding river on a schedule, and a workforce most modern governments couldn't organize if they tried. If this is the kind of "actually, here's what really happened" video you're into, I made one exactly like it on how they built the pyramids themselves. Go watch that one next, links right there. And if you want more of history's biggest myths taken apart with the real engineering behind them, subscribe. I've got more of these coming.